So good evening. I'm Ben Rich. I'm Chief Executive of Radix Big Tent. For those that don't know us, Radix Big Tent is the think tank of the Radical Centre, and we are concerned with systemic change. And it struck me that this was really one of those issues that speaks very much to a whole range of work which we're doing around housing, around investment systems, around political reform. I was really taken by this topic. I remember a particular geography lesson I had when I was 12 being shown terribly scary S-shaped and J-shaped Malthusian population curves. And it stopped me from being able to sleep for months. So I'm hoping we're going to be able to at least get something of a sense behind that. And we're absolutely delighted to have Paul with us. Paul is going to be in conversation with Vicky and with everyone on this call, and you can join that conversation by using the chat function. I will do an advert at the end as well for future sessions, but we've got some really great ones coming up. We have Ian Dale, the LBC presenter, but in this case, the author of the book The Dictators, and he's joining us in February. And John Kay, who was due to join us before, sadly, he had an accident last year. I'm delighted to say is back, Professor John Kay, and he'll be talking about his book, his new book in March. So those dates to watch out for. But with that, Vicky Pryce is our chair of fellows and a very eminent economist. And a very good person, therefore, to have in conversation with Paul. Vicky, over.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be introducing Paul. Paul Morland, who is a demographer and has written quite a lot in this area. And we happened to have met on some panel on a TV program where we didn't exactly disagree, but he was quite a surprise, the sort of data that was coming out that Paul was able to bring to that discussion, which interested me hugely. And it's one of the reasons that I then suggested to Radix that we could perhaps have Paul talking about his book, which is all about the prospects of a falling population across the world. It's already happening in some places, and what the implications of that would be, and what perhaps we can do to reverse it. So it's called No One Left. And Paul is with us, and I wanted to start. I mean, we have only 1 hour, or we started a little bit late, so maybe we'll have an extra sort of 5 minutes at the end or whatever from the advertised time of finishing. But let's see how we go. Paul, do you want to talk a little bit about the book and what your main worry is? I mean, we have had loads of people already asking questions and worrying about the environment and is population decline not a good thing really at the end of the day, reducing a lot of pressure in various areas, including housing. This is the day when we were told by the ONS that on current projections, we're going to see the population rise in the UK of 5.2 million people between 22 and 2032, in other words. So in the next few years, population will be going up because of migration, and that is going to bring with it loads of pressures on housing and other areas. But over to you to tell us why it is that actually we need to worry about population decline rather than the population growth that we have all seen, and where, of course, right now the world is still experiencing an increase in population. We've passed the 8 billion and is still going up. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Delighted to be here. So let me outline in very broad brush terms the thesis of my book, No One Left, Why the World Needs More Children. It's actually my fourth book, and I've been sort of working away on demographic issues since I published my PhD thesis about 13 years ago. And there are a whole number of reasons why I think it's a problem that we're not having enough children globally. So, I mean, I'm the father of three and the grandfather of three, so just think children are a good thing. But I mean, that's very subjective, and some people probably can't stand the idea of having children. So that's not really, whilst it's very important to me, it's not going to persuade people. Although having said that, if you ask women and men how many children they want in most of the developed world, they'll say 2 to 3. They're having 1 to 2. So I think that alone is an issue. When Japan got to 100 million people back in the 60s, it had about 8 or 9 people of working age to every retiree. When it gets back to 100 million in the 2040s, probably, it will have almost a ratio of 1 for 1. Now, that's just the way these things work. I mean, the Japanese do live a long time, but if we've got a life expectancy of 80 and they've got one of 84, it's not going to be that different here. Anywhere that goes through population decline has that sort of problem. And that gives rise to an issue. In fact, I just published a paper with Policy Exchange with an economist called Philip Pilkington it came out on Sunday, which said we are going to struggle and probably fail to provide pensions, social care, healthcare, when we have that kind of structure. We're going to head for what the last Japanese prime minister, or perhaps the one before last, called societal breakdown or societal collapse. It's not just about the absolute number of people, it's also about the age structure. And you don't get to a declining population unless you have some awful plague that hits everybody equally, without going through that kind of upside down population pyramid. And if you want any kind of compassionate society, if you're not going to leave old people to their own devices, you won't have the labor and you won't have the finance to do it. And if we try, we'll either have to raise taxes to the point we'll break the economy, or we'll have to raise debt to the point that we break the bond market and break the economy. So I don't see how we're going to manage it. Now, there are a whole range of arguments against my point of view. Let me just pick up on the environmental one. Before I do, just one point about where is this a problem. It is a problem in the UK. It is a problem across Europe. It's also a problem across Asia. And what's interesting and rather distressing is it's no longer a luxury problem. Jamaica has a lower fertility rate than we do. Thailand has a fertility rate about the same. Poor countries are now going through this demographic transition very quickly, and they will get old before they get rich, and they simply won't have any kind of resources to look after their people. We've never had societies anything like this, and we don't know what's going to hit us. And in addition, I would say if you end up like South Korea, where the fertility rate is about 2/3 of a child per couple, we're not talking about, wouldn't it be nice if the population stabilized or went down a little bit? Never mind about the age structure. We're talking about 100 grandparents creating 33 parents, creating 11 grandchildren. So that is essentially watching the water going down the plug hole, if you like. That is disappearing humanity. Now, at current rates, yes, the world population is still growing, but that's not because of the fertility rate, which is about globally to plunge below replacement level. We know that decline is in the works. And actually, this is a problem at national level. There's no point saying to the Koreans, don't worry, there are lots of babies being born in Burundi. Korea has its own issues. And for reasons we may come on to, shifting people around the globe is not going to help. So let me just address the environmental question. First of all, if we are going to solve our environmental problems, we're going to do it by brilliant young brains, networking and educated young brains. It's not going to be people like me who do it. And as you get a shrinkage, people in their 20s and 30s, you can see it in many countries. You see it in Japan. I mean, there's no perfect data, but the best you've got is the number of sort of inventions that are patented, and it's gone down and down in Japan as the young population has declined. So all the brilliant ideas that allow us to have 8 million people on this planet, actually better housed, better fed, and living significantly longer than they ever have done, more than when there were 4 or more than the 2 billion, is thanks to all sorts of brilliant ideas in sustainable energy, in agriculture, that have allowed us to get to this point. We will become a declining with a declining knowledge base, with a declining number of young people. We won't get the inventions that will sort these problems out for us. Another reason not to rejoice in the declining birth rate from an environmental point of view is something I've often said, which is if you're not having children in Britain or Japan because you think you're going to save the environment, but you're still consuming the labor of others. You expect a bus driver, you expect a doctor or a nurse, you expect a bin person. And we may come on to why AI is not the problem, is not the solution either. You expect the labor of others to be there. You're not creating it yourself. You're sucking in immigration from countries with very low emissions to countries with very high emissions. A Syrian moves to Britain, someone from the Democratic Republic of Congo to Germany, or Guatemala to the US, and you're probably increasing emissions 40 or 50 times. Now, there is a debate about immigration. Is that good? Is it bad? Very good for those people. But don't believe you're saving the planet when you're effectively just sucking in labor from low emissions to high emissions countries. So, Vicky, I hope that kind of gives you a very, very rough outline of the argument and specifically addresses the environmental question, which I'm very happy to talk about in more detail.
Great. Well, thank you for this introduction. Of course, the question is, what can we do? And I think one of the things that you have outlined is, in your view, the sort of reasons why we have seen this reduction in fertility rates, which of course seems to be quite across the world. I mean, in Europe in itself, the lowest fertility rates are in Finland and in Greece, where there are, very different sort of social structures. So you can't necessarily generalize from that. And it is obvious that fertility rates have fallen because of countries getting slightly richer, and also the contraceptive pill, which has encouraged that rethink of how many children do you actually need, whereas the thought of still needing lots of kids because some of them will die, which still dominates in places like Africa, and you do document that quite well in the book, is no longer a valid reason for the developed world to have so many children. So they refuse to do it. But I mean, your argument is, when you look at the various reasons for it, that there is also a sort of societal thing. There's a change in attitudes, and yet, I mean, you do agree that one of the reasons for why it's all happening is because, of course, people change their habits. They're no longer as religious as they were. You have very, very good data which shows that in the US itself, those who go to church or have gone to church or do go to church have higher fertility rates. You even look at Spain, where, if a woman had gone to church when she was young, then she's more likely to have more children than was otherwise the case. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that, what do you want from the state? To reintroduce, more religion? I mean, obviously, that's not going to be particularly feasible. I mean, you're talking about a rethink of what exactly? Sort of paying people more to have more kids, women to rethink whether they should be producing more children for whatever reason that might be, because you think they want more children, but they can't have them because of the societal norms that have developed. Is that the argument, that let's rethink the entire sort of mentality around children? Let's follow maybe some examples of countries that are doing it better. And strangely, you mentioned Hungary. So the more right-wing the country is, and if you look at Trump supporters, they have more kids. If you look at the Democrats, they have fewer. Is that what we're talking about? Sort of more or less dictating and bribing people to have more kids to solve this problem?
Well, that covers a lot of ground. So I suppose essentially there's a kind of, why is it happening and what can we do about it? So let me tackle it in that way. A lot of the reasons that lead to lower fertility are good. They're very good things. If you go to a country that goes from 6 children per woman to 2 to 3 children per woman, what you're seeing generally is a rise in incomes, a rise in healthcare, a fall in infant mortality, a rise in female participation in the workforce. That's all excellent. And I don't want to reverse any of that. I don't want to go back to the 1950s. There's no point in saying, for example, women need to stay at home if your essential problem is the lack of people in the workforce. Quite apart from that being wrong, and quite apart from the fact, my mother, my wife, my daughters, all career women, something I believe in very passionately, that women can do just about any job a man can do, as well or better or not as well. I mean, we can't possibly step back on the issue of feminism. So the question then is, how do we invent a society where people actually want to and achieve having more children? So yes, education, urbanization, rising incomes, female education, all good things in themselves, but we've overshot. So you don't need to have 6 children in a society where all your children are going to make it through to being able to have children of their own. So I'd expect the fertility rate to come down. And I'm not going to say what the perfect rate is, but somewhere between 2 to 3 keeps the population stable and maybe slightly growing. And in a country with very low infant mortality, which thankfully is most of the world and will soon be all of the world, that could be pretty universal. Just a quick note on the. So I don't want to go back to anything. I'm not kind of reactionary. Even if I did, it wouldn't happen. And although there's pros and cons of religion, I'm not saying we all need to get religious, and I'm not preaching that the government enforces anything, religion or otherwise, on people. This has got to be about people's choices. That all should be said at the upfront. A word on the politics. It is true that people on the right in the States, there's some evidence in other countries, have more children. And I think this gets seen as a right-wing issue, and that's rather unfortunate. I did a podcast with Aram Bastani of Novara Media, and I said to him, the trouble with people on the left, and I know you're all very firmly in the centre, the trouble with the people in the left is they forget who their heroes were. Stalin used to give out medals for women having children. I'm not advocating Stalin. Fidel Castro and Mao were both in favour of large families, and no one ever riposted Malthus's miserabilism better than Marx. So this should not be a left-right issue. Empirically, it turns out that people who are more religious and more right-wing do have more children where we have the data, but that doesn't mean it should be a right-wing cause. So what should we do about it? Well, the first thing I always say... Sorry.
If the data tells us that this is what happens, how can we ignore it? In other words, and people who perhaps go to church more, and if you look at what happens in Africa and elsewhere, and you talked about ethnicity as well. So Muslim bit of Nigeria has many more kids per family than is the case for the Christian part of it. And you do refer to the fact that literacy rates are very low in Nigeria. They're even lower in Niger, which has the highest population growth of any other place. So these things do matter. You can't just sort of ignore them. In other words, quite a lot of the attitude of people who maybe you want to call them right wing, or who have a society that more or less forces them to do various things, or is more authoritarian, if you like, in terms of what it wants people to do. You end up with more kids being produced. Is that what tends to happen?
Well, empirically, you can say certain things are definitely true. More religious people have more children. More right-wing people have more children. Muslims in Nigeria have more children than Christians. Those are all very useful empirical observations. But when it comes to policy, I'm not suggesting that those become part of your policy. Let's force everyone to be right-wing, or let's force everyone to go to church. First of all, it doesn't even make sense as a policy. Secondly, if it did, I can't believe anyone would want to advocate for it. Even people on the right. I mean, you can't force people to have particular views.
Yeah.
And thirdly, even if you did force people to go to church, if they're not naturally religious, they're not going to have more children. So all these correlates are interesting, and they may give us some clues, but they are not actionable. So the question then is, which I'd like to turn my attention to, what is actionable? What can we actually do?
So you agree that secularism, as you put it yourself, is one of the reasons for the lower fertility rate?
Yes, and I think we have to invent a kind of secularism. Look, I mean, we're not going to go back to a world of deep religiosity in many countries. So the question then is, can we invent? We're not going to go back to a world where most women stay at home. They don't cultivate their minds. They don't go to universities. They don't get jobs. We're not going back there. That's just a given. The question then is, what sort of world can we imagine where all these things, which you could call progressive and which I embrace and don't want to reverse, all these things persist? And then say, is that world possible? Is the kind of liberal, democratic, progressive, enlightened, educated, prosperous, urban world we all live in, or most of us on this meeting live in, possible to reconcile with a world where we do not effectively go down the demographic plug hole?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I was going to come on to say that the first thing we could do is for government to acknowledge this as an issue. Government's not the whole thing, it's deeply cultural, but governments can sway culture. And we do tend to look to governments for solutions. Now, until recently, I said no British government, no front bench spokesman in either party has ever had anything to say about the subject. More than 50 years since our British fertility rate went below replacement level. So we've been building in this problem. Even if we sorted it out and we got up to a fertility rate of 2 tomorrow, it's 20 years before those kids enter the workforce. We've baked in this problem, and we haven't even talked about it for the 50 years it's been going on. So I used to say no front bench spokesman has talked about it, unlike, say, Macron in France, a good centrist, unlike, say, J.D. Vance, who's now talking about it in the States. But finally, we do have a politician who's talked about it, our Prime Minister. And what's he had to say about it? It's none of my business, and I'm not going to force people to have children. Well, I mean, that's a complete Aunt Sally. No one is talking about forcing people to have children. So that is a ridiculous and unhelpful contribution to the debate. So I think the first thing to say is, can we acknowledge it is an issue and that our economic woes, our really sickly growth and our need for mass immigration, which itself is giving rise to all sorts of political issues across Europe, is down to the fact that across Europe we've had 50 years of too few children. Can we at least discuss it without being all sorts of ridiculous epithets being thrown at us? So that would be a start, just being able to talk about it, which is why I'm so pleased you've invited me here. And to be fair, I've had a fair crack at the BBC. I mean, I was on the Today programme in at the beginning of the month, not for the first time. So the Overton window is moving, and we are beginning to talk about it. If we can't talk about it, we're never going to fix it. What can government do? I think there's a whole range of things. I mean, the bribes, calling it bribes is about unfair, but we could have a tax system that actually recognised children, as we have done in the past and as other countries have done.
Don't forget, we have a two-child policy for benefits.
Yeah, we could take off the cap on child benefits. We could sort out.
So we're doing the opposite.
We could sort out our housing issues, and we could start to send cultural signals. For example, if you actually ask people, what do you think the shape of your fertility is? Very few people realize how quickly it trails off as you get into your 30s. Now, people like Ben, I also learned about Malthus and the demographic transition in my geography classes at school, and they obviously left an impression. What I never learned about was the fact that the best time to have children biologically is in your 20s, and of course you can have them in your 30s, but there is your likelihood of conceiving materially starts to reduce as you get towards your middle and late 30s. If people knew that and understood it, that would be a good start. There are a million one things we could talk about doing.
Okay,
and I'm sure I don't have all the answers. But if we don't even start discussing it, and if the government doesn't recognise it's an issue, we're not even getting off the starting block 50 years after the problem emerged.
Well, the really interesting thing, Paul, is that not only did we get the ONS figures about how migration was going to increase our population quite significantly, unlike what's going on in other places. I mean, Greece, that I know quite well, would have had a huge population decline if it hadn't been for people coming in, particularly from the Middle East. And also from the former Soviet Union after the wall came down. But also we had the news that they're now finding the solution to fertility by just taking this bit of a cell from fetuses or people and then being able to reproduce at any point. And I think you don't need women anymore or something like that. It was really quite interesting. So at any age, you can continue and have kids at any age. So by the time this becomes a serious problem, Keynes he said quite rightly, in the long term, we're all dead. But there could be a solution where loads of people are born through completely different ways than the ones that we have thought about. So technology is going to change things. But there is one interesting thing before I open it up. Additionally to what you're saying, you talk about this general, I mean, perhaps it's the point that you're making that we're not talking about it. This anti-natalism, I think you call it, that it isn't just that Keir Starmer and others don't envisage this to be a problem or an issue they want to talk about, but that there is, in your view, quite a sort of negative social environment about children, which results in perhaps also producing fewer per woman. Can you just elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah, it's very hard to put your finger on it. I mean, I'd like to talk about the technology very briefly. I will say that whatever the technology is, most people do manage to conceive when they want to. So the issue is they're not having the children rather than they can't have the children. And in
Right.
terms of being able to have children later and later, I can tell you as a grandfather of 3 at the age of 60, I'm delighted to look after my grandchildren. But the idea of doing it on a full-time basis is extremely daunting in the way it wasn't when I was 30. So I think we have to be reasonable about what we can expect by way of people's ability to bring children up. I mean, in terms of the antinatalism, let me just give you one example. On Sunday evening, I was on LBC being interviewed about this paper we did with Policy Exchange. And once I was off, they then sort of spoke to someone who was from a different perspective. And of course, that's great that there are people with different perspectives. But she described herself as child free. And I find that sort of, in German it would be kinderfrei. And I find that quite creepy, to be honest. I mean, childless means you don't have children. Child free means it's something to celebrate because you're free to do what you like. And that kind of, you're debt free. And other words free we can think of, particularly after the memorial of the liberation of Auschwitz yesterday, that I find are and I don't suggest I don't want to overstate my case, but talking about being child free, I find quite creepy, to be honest. It's not. It makes it sound like it's not neutral, but it's something you want to embrace. And I think if you go to different countries, Britain is far from the most antenatal country I've been to. I've been to Korea, but there are countries you can go to where you feel that children are really embraced, and the whole of society is built around how do we bring up our descendants, how do we embrace and encourage the next generation. And I think it's very much an afterthought for people in this country and many other countries.
Well, possibly, but the children are very central for families in Greece, and yet they have very low fertility rate. And they're not very central, perhaps, that same way going everywhere with the parents here, and you have a high fertility rate. So the two things don't seem to be correlated. So we just have to be a little bit careful about how we sort of compare countries as well in terms of the importance of kids. There is no antinatalism in Greece, but they still produce very few. And I think it comes back to your main point, which is why it is that people don't have children, because you seem to think that in the developed world, once you reach a certain point of well-being, if you like, in the economy, you make a choice about this, and this choice is now dictated by all these social norms which are changing and preventing you perhaps from having children. And it's not to do with cost, and yet it is cost. If you talk to any young woman right now, you ask her whether she'd like some children, she'd say yes, but the costs are too great. We had a number. I'm already looking at quite a lot of the chat inputs, which talk about housing, about people having to live with their families still, the young people not being able to really move into a new place themselves. And so having children is still costly. I think you're arguing that it isn't very much so, and that people had had children before, even though the situation for them was even worse in terms of bringing up children. Why can't we carry on? Well, perhaps now we have more information about what having a child means. And for a woman, of course, you have a whole chapter on women, what women want, I think, or what about the women? Obviously, we've had a Nobel Prize winner who got the Nobel Prize by saying that there is a big motherhood penalty for women. So I mean, things have changed. So getting it back, and even bribing people, or even talking about having more kids by government, isn't that very, very difficult point to make? And so I'm just that way covering quite a lot of what has already been said in the chat, by the way. So just if you can answer this.
Well, I think in a nutshell, what you're saying is, and it's a really important, what's cultural and what's material. So, and you're saying material matters, and I agree it does. I mean, my own children have had to establish homes for their own to have their own children, and I know it's very expensive and very difficult. But there's something seriously wrong in a country like Korea, say, where I believe, I should check this data, the GDP per capita is 50 times what it was in the early 50s. And everyone says they can't afford to have children. Now, subjectively, I'm sure that's true. But I think we need to take a look at ourselves very carefully as a society. If we are so much richer than we were historically, and whereas historically people, even back in the 50s and 60s, when people were materially poorer than now, never mind the 1850s and 60s when they couldn't control their fertility. But at times, as people get richer, they find it harder and harder to afford children. So whether you're looking over time within a given country or over space between countries at a particular time, you generally find the richer they are, the more they can't afford children, the more they're not having children. Now, I really appreciate the problems, the cost of childcare, the cost of housing, but I think that forces us as societies to look very carefully at how we organize ourselves and say, what is it that makes it harder and harder for us to create our demographic future as we get to afford our demographic future,
Yeah, well, one
as
of
we
them,
get materially richer?
I know, and one of the questions in the chat was also, people perhaps don't get married as much as they did before. And so the fertility rate and marriage rate are perhaps correlated as well. And they don't get married because of other reasons like work or even, in some places like Greece during the Eurozone crisis, you couldn't have your own place. You had to stay with your parents. There was no way you could go. You've got a little bit of that in the book, in fact, about the different social norms that exist, which keep perhaps the numbers down. But there is one, there are a few questions there also about the religious bit. And somebody's mentioning that Jacob Rees-Mogg is a Catholic, of course. Sorry, he's not a Catholic. He's a churchgoer. So forgive me.
I think he is a Catholic. In fact, I was on GB News with him yesterday,
right. Okay,
and he said, well, we should all be Catholics then, shouldn't we? And I said, actually, and you all know this because, of course, Greece is an Orthodox country, but other countries in Southern Europe, such as Spain
and Italy,
have some of the lowest fertility rates in the world. So unfortunately, I think Abrahamic religions tend to slow the fall down. But ultimately, and I think it's interesting if you compare Indonesia, which is Islamic, to India, which is largely Hindu, or if you compare Thailand, which is Buddhist, to the Philippines, which is Catholic, you do see that Abrahamic religions slow the fall down, but they do not prevent it, as we can see in Italy, as we can see in Spain. And actually now the latest data is that Chile is almost down to the level of South Korea. I think it's about 0.8 children per couple. So two people become less than one person.
Okay,
more than half.
So despite what your evidence suggested about the US and also Nigeria, about people who go to church have more kids, or women, more kids per woman, the overall, I mean, it's just a blip, is it? I mean, the general across the world, this isn't really a defining issue.
I think in any given society, Catholic society, you'll find the more religious you are, however that's measured, the more children you'll have. But that's no guard against the fact that a country that is Catholic ends up with a low fertility rate.
Okay, well, in terms of what you can do, I mean, you mentioned migration as not being the solution. Certainly for certain countries, it probably was for Germany when it allowed all these refugees to come in from Syria and elsewhere. It had Turks, Greeks, and so on, sort of doing everything for them for a while. Otherwise, population would have gone down hugely. So migration can help. But you seem to think that there's a limit, I presume, to how many people can move from A to B, and they're not going to be the solution to this. So the solution has to be what? A change in attitudes?
Well, should we just talk about immigration and why I don't think it's a solution?
And the other one is, of course, technology.
Okay, so let's
which
talk
has been
about
asked as well.
Because I've got a chapter on both immigration and technology. The first thing I'd say about immigration is it's a Ponzi scheme. When people come in, their fertility rates adjust. I mean, Latinos in the States, certainly Muslims and Sikhs in Britain, and West Indians, and increasingly Muslims, you see a fertility rate that goes down. So what you're doing is you're bringing in a huge population, you're fixing it for a generation, and then those people get old. So what you need to do is you need larger and larger cohorts of foreign people to come in every generation. Now, that could be a possibility for Britain. It's not going to be a fix for China. It's too big, it's too poor. It doesn't have access, cultural access or attraction to people from high fertility countries. That's one thing. The second thing is that a lot of the countries we have traditionally brought immigrants in from have got very rapidly falling fertility rates. If you look at Poland and Ireland, for example, they're both well below replacement level. There was a time they were poor and they had lots of 20-somethings who'd come here. They now have fewer and fewer 20-somethings, and they are no longer significantly poorer than us. So the idea that we're rich and we can bring people in from wherever we want is, it's simply ceasing to be the case. And what you find is where there are a lot of young people, where they have a high fertility rate, which increasingly is just sub-Saharan Africa, levels of human development are very low. So it's very difficult to bring people in and expect, in their 20s, when they've had very poor education, and expect them to perform in the economy without being a drag on productivity. Now, kind of in a Guardianista perfect world, well, we're going to the third world and we'll educate everyone, lovely. But in reality, what we're finding is that more and more countries will be competing for fewer and fewer immigrants from countries which have lower and lower levels of human development. So I don't think that's a big. There's another little problem, which is called democracy. Now, I know this is very offensive to a lot of people in the centre, but not everybody loves immigration. And whatever you think of the parties of the far right, we're now seeing polls showing reform at the same level as Labour and the Tories, or even ahead. There's the AfD in Germany. There's Marine Le Pen in France. Look at Sweden. Look at Italy. Look at politics. As long as we have democracy, if people don't want mass immigration, they will eventually react to it. And, you can throw all the rude words at those people you like, but you're going to have to suspend democracy if you think people are not going to react. And the last argument I'd make in favour of thinking seriously about immigration not being the ultimate solution is it is suggested, the data is dodgy, but it's suggested we have more health workers in Britain than in Ghana. Ghanaian health workers. So we're saying we're important, we're progressive, we're enlightened, we're not having children. Dear third world, as we used to call it, you have the children. And then, you educate, you bear them, you educate them, you train them even to the level of being doctors, which in a country like Ghana is a huge commitment, a huge amount of capital has to go to those humans. And then we'll just pick them willy-nilly as we choose, and too bad for you. And I've got a friend who runs a significant investment company in sub-Saharan Africa, and he says you can really see the effect of the drain that this is having on those countries, that Europe and other wealthy countries think they have the right to continue having the health services and so on, and the labor they want, and they can just pick it from those who don't want to have children.
Yeah,
so that's my answer on immigration.
Okay, we'll come to the
AI,
AI. Just hang on a second about AI. I mean, I'm rather glad that a few Ghanaians did come because I have a half Ghanaian granddaughter. So thankful to them for making that decision. But yes, I can take your point, which is quite a valid one. However, in this country, we are still expecting migration because of business reasons to be very high over the next few years, if we believe what the ONS said and what we've seen happening recently. So yes, of course, the political climate may be changing. Look what's going on in Germany, for example, where they're about to put sort of stop anyone coming in without a proper passport. So the Schengen era may be over, but everyone still recognizes, including the Germans, that you do need that migration to keep the economy going. And it is one of the important points that you make in the book, which is that is the dependency ratio, which is a real problem. If you don't bring in more young people, youngish people who can work to keep the older there. And you say this is the most important point that we need to be making, is the dependency ratio, which is going the wrong way and which needs to be filled, because otherwise we'd be in deep trouble and the cost of the state would be so enormous. So isn't therefore migration still an important part of what we should be looking at?
I don't think we can stop migration all of a sudden, given the shape of our demography. But I think it would be responsible for us, when we think about the balance of migration and our own population filling the requirements of the labour market, at least to say that something has to give. I talk about in my last book and in this one and I've written a paper about what I call the demographic trilemma, which is you can have 2 out of 3 things. You can have the kind of society Japan wants and the Germans seem to want, which does not have mass immigration or even reverses it, and has some kind of ethnic continuity. You can have a buoyant economy, and you can have a low birth rate. You can have 2 of those things, but you can't have all 3. If you want to keep the lights on and you're not going to have your own kids, you are going to have to import people from other countries. But that is not a long-term solution for reasons I have laid out.
Okay, so on again, looking as I'm doing all this, I'm looking through the chats and noticing what everyone is saying. We've covered a number of the things about, if we are to encourage people to come to have more children, looking at the benefit system and the tax system is perhaps one way of going about it. The motherhood penalty, people are talking about this and saying that indeed also women have to stay at home. They don't pay enough for their pensions, then they have a real pensions penalty that they have to deal with too. And there are the different ways you can bribe people. I mean, I was thinking about when you talked about Germany earlier, Ursula von der Leyen, who, of course, at the time that she was starting having her children, in order to, of course, do something about the German population, which had been quite badly affected by the war and everything. If you had a 7th child, then the president of Germany, different to the chancellor, would be your godfather. And indeed, her 7th child has the president as their godfather. So she did have 7 children. And quite a lot of Germans did have quite a lot of children at the time. But you can go about it through the tax system. But I think, as you say in the book, which I think is quite interesting, that even if you did that, because the number of people, of women of an age that they can indeed have children is declining, you would not be able to replenish the drop that would be happening anyway. And I think that for me was a really worrying statistic. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, we have something called the demographic momentum, which means that, and that we've been benefiting from since the 70s. The fertility rate's below replacement, so we're having less than 2 children per woman. But if you think of the pyramid back in the 70s, not that many old people, because they had large families, and a lot of them had died relatively young. Lots and lots of young women and men having not that many children, but they were having more children than people were dying. So there was momentum. After you go below replacement level, the population can continue growing organically for decades because you've got lots and lots of youngsters relative to the old dying, having not that many children. But eventually you get the opposite of that, which is you've got lots and lots of old people dying because you've just got lots of old people. You've got so few young women that even if they're having quite a lot of children, they're not offsetting the number of older people who are dying. And that's a kind of inversion of demographic momentum. That's what you get when you have 50 years of sub-replacement fertility and no one's talked about it and no one's done anything about it. Now, there is no easy fix to that except to get the pyramid back in shape. And the only way you do that is to raise the number of children that are being born.
But as you said, it takes time, and also all you do is perhaps sort of make the decline be a little bit slower. But the other thing is, of course, what has been done in various places, like increasing the retirement age, making more people work. But if you look at the statistics, of course, what you find is that there are very few places where the percentage of people over 65 that work is at all reasonable, except in Japan, which, of course, needs this. About 13 or 15% of over 65s work in the population, which is considerably higher than is the case. I think in the UK, it's about 3 point something. Which is similar to the US. I mean, isn't that one other way of doing it, particularly as people are healthier? I mean, one of the reasons why that you do have more people of an older age that need to be looked after, in inverted commas, is also because longevity has improved. And those sort of stopping now, but loads and loads of places in Africa, you'll find that people start living longer as they get richer.
I think we will have to retire later. That's absolutely right. And I think we can because we're not only living longer, but we're healthier than we were. But a few points on that. One is that if you think of what I was talking about and you were talking about, the replacement, the support ratio, think of Japan with 8 workers per retiree in the 60s, and then think of it in the 2040s or 2050s with 1 for 1. Moving the retirement date is obviously going to kind of have a double benefit because it puts more people on the numerator and fewer on the denominator, or vice versa. So that's obviously helpful, but it's moving deck chairs on the Titanic, really. That's point one. I mean, it's really, compared to the demographic challenge we face, it will be quite small. The second thing is it gives rise to a huge amount of anger politically. It's really difficult to do. I mean, Macron tried to do it and kind of semi-retreated. Even Putin tried to do it and semi-retreated. And meanwhile, we know these problems are here. And of course, the first thing the government says is triple lock, triple lock, triple lock. We're not moving the triple lock. The triple lock will not be kept. That will go without a doubt, and the age of retirement will change. But you absolutely have to expend a huge amount of political capital to do that. Partly because there are so many people in there. The boomer. There are really 2 big boomer generations. One, I call them the Charles and Anne boomers, the 48 to 50s, and then there's the Andrew and Edward boomers, the sort of 60 to 64. And that second lot are approaching their retirement. There are a lot of them. They're all voters, and you will hear, and I'm one of them by 6 weeks. You'll hear a lot of screaming out of that lot if you try and change the retirement day. So it's hard to do. It's important that we do it. We can do it because people are fitter, but it's only going to be a very minor part of solving this problem.
Okay, now there are people also in the chat who are saying, we don't have very much time left, that one of the reasons why Japan has been able to sustain quite the increase in population, despite the fact it has to import all its energy, is by moving into more sustainable food production. But is it not better if we have stability and even population comes down in terms of being this the environmental issue again? Because of course it will make it easier to feed the world. And of course we know this arguments that innovation can change things, all sorts of new ways of producing food are coming our way anyway. So is your answer that what I just said, that basically technology can change things?
Well, it can, and it has. I mean, we ate better when we were 2 billion than when we were 1 billion. We ate better when we were 4 billion than when we were 2 billion. And we ate better when we're 8 billion than when we're 4 billion. So we are not up against a Malthusian constraint in terms of food. In terms of stability, yes, I would like stability. You're not
so what would you like? What would you like the population to be? You want it to stay at 8 or?
I think if people have 2 to 3 children, then you get a gradual, steady growth, a moderate growth. I'm not saying that can go on forever. I'm not suggesting we move back to the world of the 70s, where the population of the world grew 2% every year. But I think you don't have stability when you have 2/3 of a child per couple. We've only seen the beginning of this. In 20 or 30 years, places like South Korea are going to be in a real crisis state. So stability is not having fewer than 2 children. It's certainly not having fewer than 1.
Okay, you had an interesting statistic as well, which I think you said somewhere in the book, that at the current rates, China is losing 850,000 people.
And it's going to accelerate.
Yeah. Is that a year? No, it can't be. It must be. Is it a year? I can't remember what the
850,000 could be a year. I mean, there's a country of about 1.4 billion people.
So it's not too big, really, a reduction of hands. But of course, the reason why their 2-child, 3-child, their sort of relaxation policy hasn't worked goes back to what we were discussing at the beginning, which is cost. I mean, people find educating their children costly. They worry about whether they're going to find jobs because there's high unemployment in various areas. So it has become, much more a question of, cost again, rather than a lot of the other concerns that you had, that there is anti-natalism and so on. So I think people around the room have expressed a little bit of that in terms of what the costs are, particularly, of course,
And
for
yeah, I
women.
would point you back, Vicky, to the point I've already made. I mean, the Chinese talk about never had it so good. All sorts of things are bad in China, all sorts of problems. But the population's never been as wealthy remotely as it is now. And again, if they are finding it harder and harder to afford to have children when they are fantastically wealthier than they were 30, 40, 60 years ago,
That's
again, we
interesting.
have to say
Okay.
what's going on. And I think someone, I'm not watching the chat, unfortunately, you know, you're very kindly mediating it for me, but somebody said, is it something to do with late capitalism preferring consumption over reproduction? That, you
Yeah.
know, that person is onto something. I think it's something deeply problematic about the kind of world that we've created, that we get richer and find it harder to afford children. And you know, I
Okay.
haven't got the answer to that, but I think that comment is
Okay.
probably onto something.
Okay. So finally, then, just before we close, people are saying, right. So what are the policies? What are the policies apart from talking about it more? Is it taxes and also making sure that women don't lose out when they have kids? Is it providing more housing so that it's cheaper? Is it, you know, what is it? What is the policy?
So first of all, don't dismiss talking about it. I mean, when I was writing for Policy Exchange, there was some pressure about can you lay out your prescriptions? And I did to an extent. But I also said, why are we jumping onto the bandwagon of detailed policy prescriptions when we haven't? It really is important to get the politicians talking about it, because if we have, it's like designing, I don't know, it's like designing the perfect railway engine when nobody's remotely talking about building any railways. So I don't know if that analogy works, but I really think we have to get this thing going, partly because beautiful policy designs are going to be useless unless we can see something happening, partly because as we talk about it, we start talking about solutions, and I haven't got them all in my head. What I do think is it's deeply cultural. We need to address the culture. Politicians can do that to some extent. Culture is not always upstream from politics. We have to, you know, and I think liberals should know that. You know, think of all the Roy Jenkins type reforms in the 60s, which were way ahead of the culture, but have influenced the culture. So don't dismiss the ability of politicians through example, through talking about it, from discussing the problem, through educating children about how their fertility goes down over time, from helping to create role models. But ultimately, there's a limit, and then of course there are all the material incentives, and we have to experiment, we have to try things out. Things work at one time and not at another. Things work in some countries and not in other countries. There is no silver bullet. We have to experiment, we have to try things out, we have to change things over time. We have to accept that if the government and politicians are pushing at a closed door, nothing will happen. The society and the culture needs to want this. So my penultimate chapter is what can government do for us? My last chapter is what can we do for ourselves? And I ultimately do think my address is not so much to politicians as to people. You know, think about it yourselves. I think part of the problem is that we just assume there'll be policy fixes. But to get those policy fixes, there are lots of ideas. People have tried different things across the world. We have to get the politicians. We have to build the rails before we design the perfect locomotive engine. And ultimately, there is a limit. I do believe there's a limit to what politicians can do, but so far they haven't even started to try to do anything.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, I feel in a way we've covered quite a lot of ground, and also I feel that, you know, a little bit like you, I've done my bit, even though I'm not a Catholic. I have 5 kids and 12 grandchildren, and so in a way, you can perhaps I can have a tick, Paul, that at least I have listened, even though I did that before I read your book, I have to admit. But I think it is one point that we need to bear in mind as a society here in the UK. I remember some work done with the World Economic Forum about, you know, which societies do well and productivity is high, and it tends to be those that are really cooperative. Scandinavian countries are. You mentioned some of them in your book, which do well, even in terms of producing kids and looking after them. But there are loads of countries which are not cooperative, and where there is a distrust of the state. And I'm afraid the UK seems to fall into that category. So it's very, very hard to see how any instructions, if you like, from the government will filter through. But actual economic policies, might have more of an impact of the type that is described also in the chat in terms of tax and benefits and so on. So anyway, thank you very much. I think Ben is about to come on. Oh, he's on. Ben, over to you. Thank you, Paul.
Vicky, Paul, great discussion. I tend to always say this. I think we're only just scratching the surface, but I think in this case more than true than most. And I sort of really appreciate the comments made just at the end, particularly by Dennis, about the yes, but what do we do about it? And I wanted just to sort of throw open an invitation to anybody who's on this call. We carry a couple of blogs, maybe 3 blogs a week. And if you think you know what we should be doing, please feel free to use the contacts on our website and submit a blog. Tell us what we should be doing for it. If you want to do some revision before you do that, then please get a copy of Paul's book. There's a discount with it if you buy it through us, and you'll find it on Amazon as well. And it's been waved around by Paul, a good author.
And it's back to front, unfortunately. So
it works for us.
Yeah.
For those that weren't here at the beginning, we're doing one of these at least a month at the moment, and my next one I'm very excited by. It's will be me in conversation with Ian Dale, who's written a book all about dictators, which somehow seemed timely at the moment. And we'll see where that discussion takes us and what lessons we can learn about dictators. So that's on the 28th of February. Please register now. And then looking into the future, on the 10th of March, we have Professor John Kay joining us. So some really interesting ones to come. If you've enjoyed tonight, you could have been at the cinema and it could have cost you 15 quid. Why not instead give us half of that as a donation? You'll find in the chat a way of donating, or you'll find it on our website. And thank you again for all of your support. Thanks again to Vicky and Paul. And I hope to see you on the 28th of February, if not before. Take care.
Thank you all. Thank you, Paul, and Ben for the summary. Okay. So goodbye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.